Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 112, Mother Lupino.
Yes, which is about the one and only Ida Lupino, famous actress and starlet of Hollywood turned director, and one of the first members on the scene for independent productions in the 50s and early 60s.
And successor to our last topic, which was Dorothy Arzner as the second woman inducted into the Directors Guild of America and Directors Guild Association? No, Directors Guild of America. Yeah. That's
it, right? Gosh, I've never been so uncertain what DGA stands for.
So she kind of takes up the mantle, and we're going to talk about her career, both her acting career and her directing career. So before that, let's get into just a little bit of the background. She was born in 1918 in London, England, and her whole family actually came from a very long line of performers, like going back hundreds of years, through various stage performances. And I think like they kind of started off almost as like clowns, and then they actually became Shakespearean actors and actresses. I saw one tidbit that Ida Lupino had memorized every female leading character from the Shakespeare plays by the time she was like 15 or something ridiculous. So, very classically trained performer. And her dad and her parents were very encouraging of that because it was kind of the family business. That's what everyone did. That's what all the Lupinos did. So she originally started working as kind of background extras in various British movies from the British International Studios. She studied her dramatic acting at the Royal Academy, and she didn't really want to be an actor. She wanted to do more writing and more of the creation of the stories and stuff like that, which kind of becomes the whole arc of her career, is trying to move away from acting and into the more directing and writing types of roles. So she started she started starring in British films like The Love Race, Her First Affair, et cetera, et cetera. She was usually kind of a seductress character, which would kind of transition her into being the femme fatale, one of the most famous femme fatales from the classic Hollywood noir genre, which we're going to see two instances of today.
So after she ended up playing a sweeter than typical role in Money for Speed in 1933, another British International Studios picture, Paramount Scouts officially, quote,
wow, I don't know what this movie is about, but it sounds like it's about drugs.
I don't think Speed was
I don't think
lingo
it is
for drugs
from
in 1933,
but
I mean, it could be. It's probably about racing or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah.
Anyway, essentially, she was discovered by Paramount, quote, discovered, and she began starring in a series of noir and crime films and various B-movies for different studios around Los Angeles, now in America. Eventually, she would go on suspension after refusing to star in a film with Ronald Reagan, back when he was an actor, during which time she spent observing filming and editing of other productions and getting an interest in directing her own films. She eventually starred in On Dangerous Ground from 1951, where she took over some of the directing responsibilities from director Nicholas Ray, probably most famous for Rebel Without a Cause, after he took ill. She and her husband at the time then formed an independent production company called The Filmmakers.
Very descriptive.
We're called The Filmlings. It's very close. One of the films for that company is called Not Wanted, and gave her first full directing job after the original hire had a heart attack. I don't believe he died at the time, but he did die. But do note that she's really only getting these opportunities not because she's qualified, which she is at this point. I mean, we talked about how much studying and her background, but because male directors are falling ill around her.
But because
so two strokes of luck. But she was in the
but
perfect
because she
position
is
to take
qualified,
advantage.
she can do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So she's now able to jump in. Also, she controlled the production company on it, so she had the final say in the matter as well. She received her first full director's credit, on the semi-autobiographical work Never Fear from 1949.
Yeah, that's actually kind of about her experience with polio when she was younger. Actually, when she had just started in Hollywood, apparently polio started going around from the swimming pools. Which, first of all, for some reason, I didn't realize that polio was a virus. But
Yeah, that's why
anyway.
you can have a vaccine for it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why I always thought it was genetic or something like that.
Yeah. Polio and smallpox are the only two diseases we've ever completely wiped out.
Yeah. So she had polio, and it actually kind of changed her mindset, because she was very, like we said, she played a lot of kind of seductress roles and stuff like that, because she was very beautiful as an actress, and she put a lot of stock in that, in her physical appearance and her physical abilities. And so when she had polio, and it made her stop thinking about herself as much, and focus more on her mental capacities and her writing and her ability to direct and that kind of a thing. So that's kind of one of those things. And that movie Never Fear kind of goes into the mental struggle of what it means. It's about a dancer, a professional dancer, who gets polio, and she has to kind of, remove her identity from those physical abilities and kind of change to just seeing herself, having a better self-image. So I think that's kind of just interesting in her personal emotional journey.
Yeah, exactly. It's another very poignant and personal entry into her over.
Yeah.
And during that period, she would spend most of her time working on films specializing in social issues, including Outrage from 1953, which, as much as she could at the time, detailed the fallout from a rape case.
Mm-hmm. Which I had to look up is not The Outrage, which we actually covered on the podcast, which is also about rape.
I had to check the same thing. It was essentially code at the time, because you couldn't say rape because of the Hays Code. And that was kind of the tendency of her production company and the work she was working on up until The Hitch-Hiker from 1953, which is one of the films we're going to cover today, which was the first noir film made by a woman. She liked to be called Mother on set, and the back of her director's chair read Mother of Us All on it. So that was one of her strategies for getting crews full of men to listen to her instructions. And she would often leverage that non-threatening domestic feminist persona to survive in a otherwise male-dominated industry. Again, it also helped that she owned her own production company, which gave her lots of leverage. And even though she preferred directing over acting, she had to keep performing to secure funds, and eventually became known as a wily, low-budget filmmaker, utilizing a lot of techniques that are part of the indie filmmaker bag through the 60s, 70s, and even up to today. Reusing sets and actual locations, using amateur actors, product placement to get money and sponsorship for the movies. And she eventually became known as the poor man's Don Siegel. Don Siegel is kind of like, he did a lot of noir films, a lot of action films. I believe he did a lot of work with Clint Eastwood in his early career in America after he returned from his Italian exile. But which is also saying something, because Don Siegel is often referred to as like the poor man's action director. So she's the poor man's action director. And eventually she transitioned in the 60s and 70s, I think a little bit in the 80s, into a successful TV directing and acting career, including work on The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Bewitched, Gilligan's Island, and many more. But
I think she's actually the first female director to do consistent episodic work. So there had been like
almost certainly
female film directors to some extent, but like in TV was just starting at this point. It's a little bit past like Dorothy Arzner's careers when TV was starting to really take off. And so Ida Lupino was in a perfect position as far as being able to step in and being so versatile, which I think is one of the things we got to talk about. I mean, going between The Twilight Zone, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which are usually, really dramatic and sinister, and then Bewitched and Gilligan's Island, like she's all over the place in terms of what kinds of films she can make. And we're even going to see that in our episode today.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. She was really again, for a long portion of her career, she was the only female director working. And so when TV popped up, she kind of, pioneered that as well for female directors, of which there are now quite a few. I'm willing to bet, although I don't have the numbers right in front of me, just based on my experience with looking at movie credits versus TV credits and working on TV shows, that there's more. The percentage of female directors is probably higher in the TV world than it is in the film world.
And part of that is probably because, there's a lot of directing opportunities in the TV world because you can come in for an episode and out for an episode and that kind of thing. But
it's just
and there's
boomed
so
in
much
the past
TV
several
happening
years.
right now.
I mean, well, that would be correct to say 5 months ago, Jonathan.
Yeah.
No longer.
It boomed between a couple years ago and a couple months ago.
I think the on totally different tangent, I think this pandemic will mark the end of the TV's golden era. I think the golden era was already over, but I think this kind of knocked it down. Not to say that TV's trash now, just that the expectation that new show your friends are talking about is going to be the best thing you've ever seen, it's probably not nearly as reliable as it used to be.
Yeah.
We've entered a silver age of sorts.
There's just an inundation of it too. Like it's hard for everything to be great.
No, I mean, how can you dominate the TV scene anymore like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones did? Like
even a platform,
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
It's impossible. There's too much coming out. But that is besides the point. I think we've talked about that on a bonus podcast before, but that's besides the point. We are talking about 3 specific films, trying to use them as lenses to look out that wide, expansive career of Ida Lupino today. The first of which is High Sierra from 1941, which is directed by Raoul Walsh.
Who can deserve his own episode at some point.
He's a crazy dude. I love him, but he's nuts. And he also like early on in his career, he was like driving through the desert to like make a movie with Douglas Fairbanks, and a jackrabbit hopped through the windshield of his car and took out his eye. So he had an eye patch for like his entire career.
He sounds like a movie character.
Yes. No, I mean, that's like the entirety of early Hollywood. They're all crazy like cowboys, essentially, of the film world. That's what early like teens and 20s Hollywood is. And that's that crazy. Movie stars Ida Lupino and our old favorite, Humphrey Bogart. Then we're going to watch and discuss The Hitch-Hiker from 1953, directed by Ida Lupino. Again, that's that first female-directed noir film that we were talking about. Also, I think probably a very good, the best example I've seen so far of her as an independent filmmaker.
It's so indie. It's so stripped
It's so
down.
indie. Yeah. It's like indie before French New Wave was indie, which is like impressive.
We could go out and shoot that kind of thing. You really just need actors and a car and some prop guns.
Finally, we're going to talk about The Trouble with Angels from 1966, which is her only color film we're going to be talking about today. Also, the final full film she directed of her career. Obviously directed by Ida Lupino and starring Rosalind Russell and Haley Mills.
Haley Mills, most famous probably for The Parent Trap. And the film actually has a lot of parallels with The Parent Trap.
It really does.
We'll get into that.
There's a lot of angst in there. It's a very, very 60s movie.
Yeah.
Lots of Technicolor. But also very female-oriented in a time period or a decade where a lot of those films didn't exist. So it's kind of important in that regard. Got a weird reception when it came out. Anyway, there's a story to all of these films. But without further ado, let's jump into High Sierra from 1941. Jason, take it away.
High Sierra from 1941. Roy Earl, a gangster heistman, has spent many long years in jail. That is, until the gangster boss Big Mac has him released from prison to lead a job on a resort in the town of Tropico Springs, California. He makes his way up into the Sierras and meets with his crew for the job, a group of inexperienced and scared young men. In addition, he finds himself caught between 2 young women, one an innocent girl with a limp Roy pays to heal, the other a dance hall girl caught in an abusive relationship with one of Roy's crew, a relationship that Roy puts an end to. Back in the real world for the first time in years, Roy is torn between two roads, one leading to redemption and the other to a spiral of self-destruction. That is if forgetting his past is even an option.
So, High Sierra is kind of a movie, in a lot of ways, that's kind of about fate. And, like, your struggle against fate. So, our main character, played by Humphrey Bogart, starts off the movie getting out of jail, which he thought he was going to spend his entire life in. But his old crime buddy got him out because of corruption and is having him do one last job. And essentially,
one last job. That's a whole genre in itself.
One last job is like signing your own death warrant. Why would anyone do?
That's like an epitaph.
Yeah,
he just wanted one last job.
He just wanted one last Dorito. That was the last we saw of him. But I like to look at this movie, and I got this feeling when I was watching this movie that it was very much kind of him being torn between two paths going forward. Yeah, and he's trying so hard to go towards his future, towards a future of innocence and redemption, but the entire way he's being dragged down back towards his past, back towards crime, back towards this fate that is awaiting him at the end.
And he actually gets rejected by the innocent path too.
He does, really which is important because when I looked at the promotional poster for this movie, it says something on it along the lines of "He killed, so he must die." Literally on the poster, which is like Hays Code 101. If somebody does something wrong in a movie, especially if they're a criminal or a gangster, or a drug dealer or a pimp or something like that, they have to be punished by the end of the movie, and normally by death. It has to happen. Like, it's almost a rule. So in that sense, it's almost kind of like a meta movie, slightly. Like, we're playing with the idea that as an audience and as filmmakers, we've all been trained to expect that he does something wrong. He's a criminal. We expect him to have to be killed by the end of the movie. But also we spend the entire movie hoping he won't be, because we see how human he is and how he doesn't really want to be a criminal anymore. But he's doing it because that's the only thing he knows how to do. That's what he's drawn towards. And he and Ida Lupino's character try really hard to get away from it and to live a life of freedom, but they just can't. They just can't escape it.
There was like a combination of two other noirs that we've talked about that I kept coming back to when I was watching this movie, and that's obviously mostly just for aesthetic reasons. Treasure of the Sierra Madre, because it's literally set in the Sierra, and Humphrey Bogart and all that. But also, Asphalt Jungle, because this is basically a heist film before heist films. Because we talked about how the Asphalt Jungle, it was basically the movie that popularized the heist film genre. And yet this movie hits a lot of those same beats, even down to like the femme fatale in, I guess she wasn't really a femme fatale in Asphalt Jungle, but the girlfriend character who's like, she's clinging on to him and she wants him to redeem his life, but he's so set on his one goal. And actually specifically getting back to like a home and to like almost like a farm life. And that's kind of what Ida Lupino's character is here. She's the one that's clinging on to him. She sees the goodness in him, but she's kind of, in this film, she's kind of she's also corrupted, and she's trying to, balance that and get away from it, but she's kind of too deep into it, and he's not really interested in her until he gets completely rejected by this goal that he's striving towards, which is really interesting. The comparison between the innocent farm girl and the kind of corrupt femme fatale, and how those two are pulling at him in different ways. Like, he's striving towards the one, and the other is striving for him, and they're kind of tugging him in two different directions. Yeah,
there is It definitely feels like the second he learns he's not going to be allowed into the world of peaceful farm owners, he accepts his lot in life and almost kind of just like settles for Ida Lupino's character.
You never get the sense that he actually cares that much. Yeah.
Yeah, because I honestly think they kind of make a pretty good match.
Yeah, I mean, she has good intentions. It's not like she wants to be a hardened criminal. She's just kind of been hardened by circumstances.
Yeah, and same with him.
Yeah.
Neither of them want the situation they're in, but they find themselves stuck in it, which is what makes it kind of it's a fateful tragedy. We all know how it's going to end. And just based on the promotion of the movie from the time it came out, the original posters, they all knew how it was going to end too.
I didn't actually notice the poster, but that's interesting. It's interesting too because he doesn't actually kill anybody until pretty late in the movie. Like I'm assuming that refers to the security guard in the heist, which
I think so.
Well past the midpoint. I mean, up to that, we know that he did something wrong beforehand, but we don't see that, so it's.
Yeah, I don't think that really
counts
learn
on his record.
I think it's just the idea that he is a criminal.
Yeah.
That kind of lines him up for that death sentence in a Hays Code movie. That makes him stuck for it. But again, like there are a lot of plot beats in this movie, but I don't feel like the plot is necessarily super complicated. We see people do a lot of things, but the emotions and the motivations remain relatively straightforward in an understandable way that kind of makes them super poetic in a sense that we're seeing this man struggle against his own fate.
It builds this really poetic tableau that we talk about a lot with this thematic tableau that we talk about with noir films, where you have the good girl and the bad girl and the life of crime versus this desire for innocence and all of these things that kind of build up to one climax that is basically just justice being meted out, usually in tragedy. But it is interesting that, this isn't one where, he was necessarily like being betrayed. It was almost like he was just on a treadmill and he could never kind of catch up with where he was trying to get to.
He was trying to turn the speed down, but it just wouldn't go down.
Yeah.
All right, so what do you think of Ida Lupino as a femme fatale? What do you think it is about her that makes her suit the role so well, Jonathan?
She has a very... she's really good at doing this sternness. This, like she's not going to get pushed around if she doesn't want to be. She does a lot of kind of pining for Humphrey Bogart, but that's kind of her own volition. It's not like... If she's being pushed around, she can stand up to it, or like she can take it. And there's the bit where Humphrey Bogart he basically starts a fight for her, but she always feels like, if she's got a problem, she's going to come up and take care of it herself. And I think that really helps because you've got a bunch of these really tough and hardened, and especially in contrast with the farm girl, who never really has anything. She ends up having to stand up for herself, and it feels like it takes something out of her. Like she breaks down after she has to reject Humphrey Bogart. And
she's kind of going through that. I think that first step on the path. That I don't think she'll take any more steps on the path either. But it's something that probably happened to Ida Lupino's character a long, long time ago. That first breaking of the self to do something hard.
And it's not to say that's wrong. I mean, she was expressing her own feelings, and he got the wrong idea just based on all the other things that their connection had kind of formed. But she wasn't interested in taking that relationship further, and it's the only thing that he was holding on to. So she wasn't persuaded into something that she didn't believe in, and yet that's kind of the thing that broke him. There's so many like layers to that bit.
Yeah. And you know what? I don't even think he was that in love with her. I think he was in love with the idea of the escape that being in love with her represented.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of getting
life.
away to a safer life, to a life without crime, to a life without being in jail and pulled out of jail by old criminals who want a favor.
Yeah. Which, he kind of saw her as that escape, but once he saw that, he was unwilling to consider any other options. And so when he couldn't reach this one specific way out, he just kind of gave up.
He is, as a character, very good at trapping himself.
Yeah.
Like, that's how the movie ends. Is him trapping
and then
himself.
there's the confrontation scene where Ida Lupino goes in after he goes back to see her. And, they have this kind of face-off, mostly just for Ida Lupino's character to get, peace of mind that the other girl doesn't actually love him, and all that. So there's so many like layers, and everyone is representing something different.
Yeah, no, I also appreciate how much agency Ida Lupino's character has, because she does act independently quite a bit.
Yeah, her and the farm girl, because the farm girl never feels like, like she's being pressured into anything either.
Yeah,
or when
she does what
is,
she wants.
She stands up to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So none of them are kind of the damsel in distress type of character.
No. And I think that's actually something that I've seen quite a bit from Raoul Walsh specifically. He was one of those early directors who learned how to direct based off of like life experience. And he's got one of those crazy stories, like he's in the Bogdanovich book, Who the Hell Made It? Where he talks about his early life of like, I was bored, so I went out west to become a rancher, and then I was a cowboy, and then I was a sailor, and then I was like a bullfighter, and like all this like just crazy stuff. And just based off of that life experience is how he learned how to direct, how people kind of actually act. And I think it's hard to say for anybody who actually observes how people actually act to not give female characters that much agency. Yeah. Like, they're people. They have agency. They have their own wishes and desires, and they act on it. But it is a nice role to see Ida Lupino in, and I think it might be one of the things that helped influence her desire to make noir in the future.
Yeah, and this is not the only noir that she was in. She became famous for being that really stern, really hardened type of character in these movies. I mean, that's kind of what most of these movies are about, is, these really strong characters, and they often have female characters that are either criminals themselves, or they are drawn to criminals and that kind of thing. And she had that presence and that command that made her fit into those roles a lot. It's not what she wanted to do all the time, but it's what she got pretty famous for. So she did a lot of them. And then eventually she went on to make her own noir film, which actually has 0 female characters in it.
Yeah, that's a hard bottle film. It's a hard bottle film, which is one of its strengths. And it's particularly violent. So I don't know if I entirely... I kind of understand her decision there.
Yeah.
But we're also going to talk about The Trouble with Angels, which is all female characters.
Yeah, completely.
So it kind of ends up balancing itself out. And also, that's kind of her putting the story ahead of other things, which is important.
Yeah. So, shall we move on to The Hitch-Hiker from 1953?
Yes, we shall. Jason, take it away.
The Hitch-Hiker from 1953. 2 men, Edmund and Frank, are driving from their home in El Centro, California, to a fishing trip in the South when they make a last-minute decision to turn towards San Felipe on the Gulf of California. Along this route, they pick up a hitchhiker named Emmett Myers. Emmett Myers turns out to be a psychopathic serial killer who's been hitchhiking rides across the country as he kills the drivers. Myers pulls a gun on Edmund and Frank, compelling them into a road trip crime spree that quickly goes sideways. It's up to Edmund and Frank to get a step ahead of Myers or pay with their lives.
All right. Jonathan, you had seen The Hitch-Hiker before, hadn't you?
Okay, so I had found out about this movie. It's like public domain, or you can find copies of it everywhere online. So I've had it like downloaded, and I've wanted to watch it, but I hadn't actually got around to watching it until this episode.
Understood. Well, I think it's an interesting story, but I think the funnest way to take a look at this movie is in how well made of an indie movie it is, and how early of an indie movie it is. So let's go ahead and define indie real quick, because it's maybe not what you think it is. Most people know indie stands for independent. Hopefully you do. But it really just means something that's made away from the official or unofficial influence of a major studio. Something that's made on your own
resources.
time. Which means resources, which are hard to match in a market that's dominated by large, flashy Hollywood movies. And especially in an era where, save for a few exceptions, there wasn't a lot of movies that were so like narratively or stylistically unique or dramatic or different that you had to go see it, regardless of like the budget that was put behind it. Yeah. You went to your local Paramount movie theater and you saw whatever Paramount was putting out that week if you liked movies. That's pretty much what happened. So it was very hard for an independent filmmaker to get something out there in front of eyes. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, over the years,
and this is also the age of the epic. Like between the late 50s and early 60s, like epics were the thing. Like from
these are big historical epics.
Lawrence of Arabia, Ben-Hur. You've got all of these huge, like really, really flashy movies coming kind of out of the.
How much money can we put into it?
Yeah, noir films are not huge, big budget type productions. Like they had a lot that goes into them, but when you're moving out of the late 40s into the 50s and 60s, like the budgets are getting bigger. These are the things that are in vogue, are huge, really big, flashy, colorful movies. And here comes Ida Lupino, who, doesn't want to play by all the rules that the studio wants her to. She's tired of playing the bit roles and the femme fatales, which she was very good at, but she wants more control. And so she's like, well, screw it. I'm going to start my own studio. And she wrote and directed this. So she wrote it with her then husband. And so she's got all the control over this production. And she's got,
and decades of experience making noir films as an actress. Right.
And just watching them being made, whether she was in them or not, just kind of hanging out around the studios. And so she gets, enough of a budget for 3 guys in a car. And literally the opening title card is, this is a movie about a man, a car, and a gun. And that's really what the movie is about.
Yeah, no, it's really simple. There's like 3 main characters. Occasionally you see a few more, but they're pulled in for like extras. A hot second. Yeah. They're pulled in for like a scene, and that's it. Very few, locations that are all just driven to in a car and probably all shot in the desert outside of Los Angeles.
Yeah, right.
There's a few small towns, but those are easy to shoot. And a really, really simple plot. 2 guys have essentially been kidnapped by a psychopath serial killer Hitchhiker, who is going to use them on a crime. Essentially, who's going to use them on a crime spree and kill them at the end of it if they can't figure a way out. And that's
or any time during it, because we've seen at the very beginning, there's like a montage of him just like randomly killing this couple and this old guy. We don't know why he killed them. We don't know how long he was in the car with them. But yeah, we know that the danger is real. And actually, by the end of the movie, I was like, how are they still alive?
Yeah, right. No, it's crazy.
He shows himself to be a psychopath.
He's a total psychopath. It's crazy. But yeah, it's such a simple plot setup that and these are super important explanations of why a lot of indie movies do this. One, it's dramatic and attention grabbing. Two, it doesn't require a lot of explanation. There's no deep, complicated backstory as to why this guy is a psychopathic serial killer. He just is. And we accept it and we move on, and we don't spend the time or the very valuable film resources making scenes or a plot line about that, or hiring the extra actors or all that stuff. We keep it simple. We keep it tense. It's a struggle for survival.
It's just a power thing the whole time.
Yeah, it's all very, and this is where her being an actor comes in handy. The thing that makes each scene good is that there's the threat of death, and then it's power plays between the three characters, which makes it really interesting. It's hard not when people are those power shifts in scenes are one of the key beats that can make a scene interesting and grip and make it significant in the overall plot of the play, even when there isn't a lot of action necessarily going on. And there's a lot of, I also want to point this one out really too, because this is important, especially for anyone who's doing indie stuff. They shoot a lot of it at night, which makes it way easier to shoot.
Actually, that's not necessarily true. So first of all, it can be, but it also means you need a lot more resources in terms of lighting and cameras that can handle it and that kind of thing, especially these days. But I think one of the things with the Hitch-Hiker is that they do day for night, which is way easier to do in black and white.
True.
But a lot of times, especially with like modern digital cameras that just look like garbage in low light, like if you're going out with kind of a cheap DSLR or something and trying to make a film these days without a lot of good lighting, then the nighttime is usually not the time that you want to do it. But it's a little bit different in the setting that she was making this.
It's not like the cinematography is not inspired. It's more like it's just solid,
utilitarian,
super. Yeah, it's very utilitarian. There you go. She doesn't overreach in areas of the film where she knows she doesn't have the resources to back it up, but
it still looks very good for what it needs to do.
No, it looks great.
And I just love black and white in general. So the really contrasty kind of deal, especially, noirs and black and white go so well together. And this is, not quite into the realm where we're turning noirs into neo-noirs.
This is like borderline neo-noir.
Yeah, it might be like the very beginning of that, just because the classic noir is kind of at its tail end. But it still has all of those classic elements. But actually, Alex, I almost want to challenge this, because at some point in the film, I started to feel that it was almost more of a Western than it was actually a noir. Did you get that sense?
Just because of the sheer amount of road travel. Yes.
Yeah, the travel. I mean, it literally takes place in Mexico for most of it. And there's, I think the moment when I started to think about that, and I was like, actually, a lot of this kind of feels that way. I mean, you've got the bandit and the innocence and that kind of thing. But when they sabotage the car and they have to walk across the desert, and I started thinking about In the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, when Ugly makes Clint Eastwood march across the desert for a really long time. I was like, wait a second. This is actually hitting a lot of those beats with the, a lot of the, so it's kind of on the border between a noir and a Western in a pretty interesting way, because it's not like a classic Western, but it's also not really a classic noir, because we're missing a lot of the things that go into a noir as well, like a femme fatale, like an element of the law and that kind of thing.
And I feel like that's actually one of the things, I can't remember if we specifically talked about it, but I feel it's like it's almost a signifier of neo-noir when noir starts to be mixed slightly with other genres.
I can see that.
And I feel like this is, again, on that line. I don't know if I go so far as to say it is neo-noir, but it's like a precursor to it, more so than a traditional Hollywood B-picture neo-noirs are, because this isn't even a Hollywood B-picture.
Yeah, it's definitely like its own thing. And at this point, like indie film is just its own thing because it wasn't anything else at this point. Okay, so one of the other things that I want to get into that I think also distinguishes it from classic noirs in a lot of ways is the ending. So I'm going to put down the spoiler warning here. This is available everywhere. You can watch it on Tubi, or you can find a copy on Internet Archive. There's actually a good HD quality on Internet Archive somewhere. So I'll put a link to that in the blog post. But Alex, what did you think about the ending? Because in some ways it reminded me of, like, in its setting and tension, it reminded me of like Touch of Evil, but the actual conclusion of the film is very different.
Yeah, no, it ends well, which I'm surprised by. It's kind of very much. It kind of feels like the Hays Code coming back in again in a way, or at least the sheer convention of Hollywood during this era of always having happy endings. It feels like that's coming back into play here, which makes sense.
And yet it feels like there's so by the time I got to the end, it made me kind of rethink the whole point of the movie, because it is very optimistic. Like, it is kind of a rose-colored ending where the bad guy gets caught by the police and gets taken away, and the two guys kind of, like, you know, put their arm around each other's shoulders and limp off into the distance. But I think at that point I realized that the whole movie was about their friendship, and I hadn't really been watching it for that. And but it just made me, like, rethink the whole thing. It's about how these two guys interact with this criminal who's holding them at gunpoint, and the opportunities in which they have to betray each other and or ditch each other, and they don't. And contrasting that with the hitchhiker, who is, you know, lone wolf, very proud of the fact that, you know, he can take care of himself. His gun is his only friend. And then the real life friendship of these two guys overcomes the dependence that the hitchhiker has on the gun, which is a symbol of his perceived power.
So I did not go nearly that deep on this movie. I didn't pick up on any of that.
I think it's in there, and I didn't think about it until, again, like at the very end. I was like, wait a second, I think there's another level, because they do have those conversations about how much he trusts in his gun, and, you know, without the gun you're nothing, and it's also about, because there were a couple instances where the two guys were like, yeah, just leave, just go take care of yourself, and yet they stick to each other even when it proves more dangerous for one of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fair. That's totally, I mean, it's there. It's not out there, for sure.
Yeah, I know. I think it looks really simple on its face, but I think that, you know, if you look into it, there actually is some levels of complexity in the story, even though the setup and the presentation is really, you know, stripped bare.
I feel like that might be one of those things where art exists beyond its creator's intentions. Kind of, I mean, I kind of just I didn't pick up on any of that, but maybe it was there intended, but there's also this strength to films and other art forms like this where upon multiple viewings and different people with different viewpoints viewing it, you can extract different meanings from it. So maybe it was there, maybe it was intended, but regardless of whether or not it was intended, it can be inferred, which is the strength of it.
Mm-hmm. And there are enough hints that, you know, at least give me the idea that it probably was intended to some extent, and whether or not the audiences really, like, resonated with it is kind of up for debate. And I mean, that kind of, a lot of people do consider this her best film. And so I think some of that may go into that. And she does have kind of reputation for making films that have very kind of sympathetic and empathetic portrayals of characters, and I think that friendship element kind of goes into this. Although there was one thing that I was really confused about, which was this implication that the two guys were lying to their wives about something. Like they said that they were going to go to this one spot and go fishing, but they were actually going in like an opposite direction.
So they changed their destination last minute, which I didn't think it was like them lying to their wives. I thought it was just like,
the Hitchhiker kind of implies that they lied to their wives about something. So
I think that just might be the Hitchhiker messing with their heads.
Yeah,
I think what I read into that moment was that this was just a poor twist of fate in a way, like how you're a few steps away from destiny and then you get hit by a bus. You know, not that we've ever seen that in a movie. But, you know, you might be like, we'll make a decision to go to San Felipe instead. And then, oh, no, we've picked up a crazy psychopath. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. There was one, for a while, I thought that they gave the Hitchhiker story that was untrue, just to kind of not raise suspicions or something, but then it was like reported in the radio cast or something like that. So I wasn't sure about that, but I mean overall, like it's really simple. As far as they're going to this place, this guy kidnaps them and tells them to drive in this direction. And I mean the hitchhiker's motivations are like really simple too. He just wants to get to this one town where he doesn't have any heat at the moment, or something like that. I mean, like he's just trying to get there. He doesn't have a lot of, and he's just messing with these two guys on his way, and he's not afraid to kill anyone, that prevents him from getting to his destination.
Yeah, in his own little crazed way. Mm-hmm. I think it just goes to show. I think the big takeaway from it is. It should show that female directors were viable in classic Hollywood. It's just that they were consciously chosen to not. There was a conscious decision to not go with them.
Yeah, and the other thing is
there's
like
nothing like if you watch this movie, there's nothing about this movie that tells me, or actually I should say, everything about this movie tells me that Ida Lupino could make a winning film noir at the Hollywood budget level. And have it be super successful. It's
like
just
this film
that
could have gotten her to direct Bonnie
her.
and Clyde, basically.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think that it's proof. It's proof that is possible.
And the other thing is, these are not like quote unquote women's. This is not like a quote unquote women's film. Like we talked about with Dorothy Arsner. Like a lot of her things, relate to women's struggles and women. Empowerment to various degrees, and they're kind of geared towards women in some ways, and yet this film fits directly in with a guy's film. It's about a dude with a gun holding up two other guys, and all the tension and stress that comes with that. Like it's an exciting film, and she was able to do that and pull it off and make it work. And she's not limited to female films. I mean, we're going to see that with The Trouble with Angels. She did a lot of stuff about, rape and unplanned pregnancy and even bigamy, which is kind of out there. But, this film shows that she's not limited to that in her range of abilities. I mean, even in the TV work that she directed shows that she's not limited to that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. This is just another example of how wide and diverse her capabilities were as both an actor and a director. But alas, should we move on to The Trouble with Angels, Jonathan?
Yeah, let's talk about The Trouble with Angels. Jason, give us a summary.
The Trouble with Angels from 1966. Mary Mary and Rachel are two rebellious, troublesome teenage girls who are sent off to a Catholic boarding school by their parents. Once at St. Francis Academy, the girls repeatedly butt heads with the Mother Superior, smoking, skipping class, and playing an ever-escalating series of ridiculous pranks. But as these girls hover here at the end of childhood, the deeper problems in their lives that may have triggered some of these rebellious behaviors bubble to the surface. Perhaps there's a chance that Mary and Rachel will find some sort of redemption in their friendship, pranks, and the school.
So, Jonathan, I've been led to understand that you've seen this movie growing up and that it's one of your family's favorite movies?
Yeah, my parents had this movie. It's one of those movies that my parents had this affinity for, these kind of out of the way comedies that a select amount of people actually know about, and it turns out that they show up in our film studies. So I think that's hilarious. They're just these little hidden gems of comedy. There's so many one-liners in this film that my parents say all the time, so this movie is very quippy and screwball-y. But the setting is very interesting because it's set in an all-girls school, and the cast is almost entirely female. But it's kind of an age tension thing between the older nuns and the young students.
It's essentially a coming-of-age movie.
Yeah,
it's a coming-of-age comedy movie. That's, with very rare exception, I think there might be one or two male characters who pop in for a hot second and then they're gone.
The two dads that are both terrible, and then the headmaster of the boys' school across the way that they take their band outfits over to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's some crazy pranks in here too. But yes, it is almost entirely female. There's no romance plot in the entire movie,
which I think is not to be lightly dismissed. We should definitely talk about that.
No, it's definitely there. It's completely focused on the friendship and essentially like a comparison of two girls who are both rebellious, and we examine why they're rebellious, like what happened to them in their past that's made them this way or has led them to be this rebellious, besides it just being the 60s in general.
And them being teenage girls.
And being sent away to Catholic boarding school. Even that has an implication.
They were sent to Catholic boarding school because they were rebellious.
Exactly. I'm saying, that has an implication of you did something that got you sent here.
Right.
Or somebody did not like how you were behaving, so you got sent here. And watching them struggle with trying to come into their own maturity with a character who's essentially just begging them to accept responsibility for their lives moving forward.
Or just any kind of responsibility, really.
Yeah, like any kind of responsibility at all, really. And, there's it's essentially framed as like a series of pranks, jokes, and so on, which makes it funny.
It's like The Parent Trap without the romance plot and the family stuff. You just strip all that away, and it's just a series of shenanigans.
Yeah, it's very true. Now, one thing I want to ask you about, Jonathan, and this is something I read while researching this film, was that when it first came out, it wasn't very well received. And one of the reasons it wasn't very well received was that the decision by one of the girls to stay with the nunnery or the convent at the end of the movie felt unmotivated. And I'm curious what your take on that is. Yes. Yeah.
I completely disagree with that.
Okay. I mean, why do you disagree with that?
So it's a slow burn. And I'm not saying that the movie is perfect, but I don't like this argument.
I have it here down on paper in your affidavit. This movie is perfect. Signed, Jonathan Satchel.
Oh, gosh. There are a lot of moments where we see Haley Mills, what's her name? Mary, I think. Where we see Mary, have these little glimpses of realization. So when the one sister leaves to be a missionary to a leper colony somewhere across the world, and Mary is just so perplexed about that because this is, they tell us that she's the most beautiful of the nuns. And so they think that she's going to go off and, get married and get swept away by some handsome man. But she wants to go serve the lepers, which puts her in danger of having her physical appearance marred. And Mary doesn't understand that. And so the sister tries to explain to her that it's because she has a genuine love for these people and she wants to help them. And then there's I think it's like a Christmas mass or something where she goes and she's hiding and she just kind of like watches the ritual of the nuns, going through. I don't exactly know what happens at that Christmas mass, but there are all these like little moments that happen with just Mary. And at almost all of those moments, Rachel isn't there. And I think that's something really interesting is the differences in Mary and Rachel and how that goes into the end and Rachel feeling betrayed and all that kind of thing. But, they give us all of these little clues along the way that are never really the focus, but they kind of are the focus as indicated by the very end. It's kind of like The Hitch-Hiker, where at the very end, you realize what the movie was actually about all along.
Yeah, it is a very subtle form of filmmaking. And one that wasn't necessarily super common in comedies of the day. And probably unexpected. It kind
of subverts the comedy genre, which may be the thing that people felt the disconnect with, but I think that enhances the quality of the comedy because it is a comedy with another purpose. It's not just there to be shenanigans. I feel like the movie would fall a lot flatter if it was, they messed around with the nuns for a couple years and then they went off and they were better people because of it, without that really big change at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say I understood her motivations watching this through the first time, and I actually quite enjoyed the character arc there. And I like the idea of one girl kind of being complacent and being a rebel for most of the movie, and the other one kind of searching for something more and then finding it over the course of the film, which was quite nice.
Yeah, the other interesting element to that is the difference in Mary and Rachel's characters. Like, Mary is always the instigator, and they even bring this up in the movie. Mary is the leader and Rachel is the follower. So you would almost expect Rachel to be the one who, kind of more gets more led into the convent, just kind of following after the other sisters and that kind of thing. And she tends to have the more kind of subdued personality. And yet they also bring up the fact that is what makes Mary's decision so much more impactful than, someone who's just kind of going with the crowd, like, because she sees all the other nuns are doing it. So, okay, I guess that's a pretty good way to live life. I don't want to go back to my home or my dad or whatever, but it's, Mary who, would not do it if she wasn't truly convinced that she wanted to or needed to.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That makes sense. All right, so what do you think about the brand of humor in this movie, Jonathan? It's a little bit irreverent. It's a little bit zany. It's a little bit unexpected and ridiculous.
Occasionally slapsticky.
Yeah.
I mean, it really has a lot going for it in the comedy realm, because there's physical comedy, there's dialogue comedy, there's just situational comedy, just being in a habit or an abbey. I don't actually know what the technical term for the school that they were at is, but it's I guess they call it a nunnery. But I never know if that's a technical
Get
word
thee
or not.
to the nunnery.
Get thee to a nunnery. Which she would have been very familiar with, Ida Lupino. Just I feel like that setting presents a lot of opportunities for comedy. What were your thoughts on it going into it fresh because again, like I haven't seen this movie in a long time, but I was familiar with a lot of the elements of it. So what was your first impressions of it?
I enjoyed it quite a bit. It felt like a fun movie, and it felt like it had a really nice character arc to it. I didn't get a lot of punch out of it from the comedy, which makes sense for a light-hearted comedy.
It's kind of just a consistent level.
Yeah. There's not a lot of rise and fall of tension in it. At least for me,
because I think it is one of those really like slow build things it's all under the surface, and so you kind of keep the surface pretty level without doing a lot of upsetting the status quo, and then that makes the dramatic twist at the end, more potent.
Exactly. No, it kind of does exactly what you expect it to do over the course of the film. I didn't feel like I got too many surprises. There's one or two, but they were it was kind of something that I expected there to be some trauma for these girls in the past to explain what they were doing now. I just didn't know the specifics of what it was going to be.
They kind of just allude to a general neglect.
Yeah. I feel like it would be safe to call this no thrills, which is okay because I don't think that's what it's going for.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a safely fun movie with a heart and kind of that underlying introspection, which is interesting because a lot of times comedy can just rest on being funny without adding anything else to it. And I think the other interesting thing too, as far as the setting, is that there are so many ways that we have seen nuns be portrayed, all the way from, I don't know, I'm trying to think of two extremes, because you have like you have this kind of a movie where it's like a comedy, and then you have like Black Narcissus, where it's kind of like subverting the whole idea of nuns.
Oh gosh.
And then even like something like
nun movies. Oh yeah.
And then even something like Doubt, which we haven't covered on the podcast, but that goes into kind of almost a more sinister aspect of Catholicism and that kind of thing. But this doesn't fall into any like huge nun stereotypes. I feel like they were all very sympathetic, and they were never the ruler knuckle rapping kind of I don't even know what to call it. Like they were never the stern disciplinarians. There we go.
The stereotypical nuns.
Yeah, and they weren't like pushovers, because I mean we have to build an understanding between the two characters, and so they were not hard stereotypes on either side, which I think can be a really hard line to walk these days, because there are so many stereotypical depictions of nuns. But this movie does a really good job of not making you feel like discredit them as, they're just the really strict legalist religious nuns, or they're just power hungry or whatever.
Yeah, just a more appealed towards discipline than they are to morality or teaching. They kind of supersede that in a lot of ways. All of the nuns in this movie seem to be full, complex human beings, except for that one who's just old.
Yeah, the one that's sleeping.
That's her entire
Sister
character.
Prudence, she seems to be asleep, which I thought was, as far as a thematic line goes, having Sister Prudence be asleep at the nunnery, and then seeing all the imprudent acts that the two girls do is just one of those other little like subtle things that kind of slips in there.
Yeah, no, it's quite fascinating. All right, Jonathan, anything else to talk about on The Trouble with Angels?
The color.
Oh yes, that's right. I think this is Ida Lupino's only color film. I'm pretty sure. Oh,
really?
This was her last feature film, but she didn't. So there was a big gap between the film right before this and The Trouble with Angels. Mm-hmm. It's like almost a 10-year gap, I think.
With a lot of television in there, but no film directing.
Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Television, by the way, would transfer over to color much later, not until the 70s. But yes, there was a big gap between the two. So there is a lot of bright Technicolor in here. She does use a really good palette, I think. I think there's this tendency of a lot of movies in the 60s to way over punch up the color, which I can understand. You suddenly have color to play with, and sometimes you want to overdo it. I get it. And sometimes it works really well. But a lot of times it can come off as way too much color. But in this one, there is a lot of pastels worked in. There's a lot of blacks and whites worked in. And the neutral, like, stone of the nunnery itself kind of helps keep the overall palette relatively balanced.
Yeah, and so that based on just the virtue of the setting, you have their uniforms, which are all white and gray, the nun habits, which are all black and white, and then, like you're saying, that really muted earthy tones in the stonework in the nunnery. But every time there's a break, which we skip over all the like Christmas breaks and summer breaks, but every time we see them about to go on break, they're all wearing really bright colors. And they come back with a lot of like pinks and greens and yellows. And even like the dress that Rachel is trying to make that Rosalind Russell's character helps her finish. And then their band uniforms that win them the medal, not necessarily because of their band skills, are very bright and red. And so when they do have those pops of color, they're used in order to stand out from the really kind of drab colors of the rest of the nunnery scenes.
Yeah, which makes sense because they're the kind of like loud, boisterous rebels here in this otherwise black and white, neutral toned area.
Yeah, world and mindset and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's about it for The Trouble with Angels. Let's move on into overall notes, whatever we haven't covered yet.
All right. Okay, so Ida Lupino overall, brilliant actress, although apparently she was never that into it, which is just
and also probably underutilized.
Also, definitely underutilized. Really, she spent most of her time in Hollywood acting in B movies. So I would say if you're someone who's familiar with that era of Hollywood, you're probably familiar with her name. But if you've run across a film, if you're just like kind of a casual film scholar or a newer film scholar who hasn't spent a lot of time digging or paying attention to old Hollywood, she's not a name you would probably know. But yeah, she kind of picked her own career path, which I find is really interesting and strong and respectable. And she optionally decided to, instead of sticking in the higher budget B movies as an actress, to go down to her own indie productions, which were harder to do, harder to fund, would never have as big of a budget or as big of a reach as the Hollywood productions had, just so she could make movies the way she wanted to make movies, which is really cool and really impressive, and I think something to definitely look up to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the different types of films that she was in, that she created afterwards, that she plugged into as far as television, like she didn't have this neat box that she fit into. And she really showed that, women can get in there and they can direct in any genre, and they can, they have a lot to bring to all aspects of filmmaking, not just films that may appeal to a specifically female audience, which I think is probably huge. And, as far as her being the first one before, Hollywood starts to, get more of the female voice in there, really helps people to see like, okay, yeah, so we can make crime thrillers and, let women direct them because they have that ability, which is kind of obvious, but not so much for early Hollywood. And so she's really able to kind of step in there, lead the way in the television arena for female directors, lead the way in, different types of films. And, like Dorothy Arzner had a lot going for her. She had a lot of complexity in her films, but they still all kind of fit in a similar genre. And Ida Lupino comes in and she's like, I'll just take on whatever genre I feel interested in at the moment. And I'm going to take on, social issues that no one is talking about. I'm going to take on all of these things that, just weren't being done, definitely by female directors and sometimes not even by male directors. And she kind of just blows the door wide open on those things.
Yeah, no, it's quite impressive. She just kind of did what she wanted. And heck, that's freaking admirable. Good for her. It's a shame. It is a shame that her stuff was never as widely recognized as her talent seemed to be worthy of.
I mean,
I feel like
she's a classically trained.
Yeah, I feel like it's important. I feel like it's important for, current people who want to learn how to make movies or study movies or are involved in getting in film production or TV production or video production of any way to study people like this and see how much talent is out there waiting to be used, and also see the detriments of putting up walls or putting up those glass ceilings to people in their way, and how much you can leave on the table in so to speak when you do something like that. Like, imagine if Ida Lupino had access to Hollywood resources to make her movies. That'd be amazing.
Like, even High Sierra, which was like written by John Huston, which we didn't bring up, but that's another tie-in to some of the classic noir stuff that we've talked about before. But you definitely feel like she could fall into the types of films that John Huston was making that were, big and had lots of very epic, dramatic scopes and thematic scopes. Like, she definitely has those tendencies. She just didn't necessarily have those opportunities, and she took the ones that she could, but you can only make so much on your own. Like, we even see that today. There's still so much that you can make on your own, and yet there's still only so much that you can make on your own.
Yeah, it's hard. Whew, it can be hard to do stuff solo, but it can often be worthwhile. Anyway.
Yeah. So what are we talking about next time on the podcast, Alex?
Well, next time on the podcast, Jonathan, we have special guest, recurring all-star summer reader extraordinaire, Jason Harden, back on the show to talk about a combination of two genres we've kind of covered in the past, musicals or music movies, and biopics, specifically biopics about musicians that kind of cover a specific borderline between recounting history and the involvement of music, and everything that goes into that. So specifically, we're going to be talking about What's Love Got to Do with It from 1993, Ray from 2004, and Love and Mercy from 2014.
Yeah, good range. Lots of Jason is big on music, and so it'll be great to get his takes on how that transitions into film, and it'll be another good, very diverse aspect that Jason has brought to the podcast. So we look forward to that. But we also have some donations. If you would like to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/thefilmlings. And there you can join our online community. We have a Discord where we record our podcast live for anyone who wants to listen in. We also have a bonus podcast at the $5 tier. And the last thing that we talked about was a short film that you can see on Vimeo that somewhat relates to Lucille Ball and kind of goes into our discussion of Dance Girl Dance with Lucille Ball. And also just kind of, that one was just fun. Just some kind of random trivia about sculptures.
All right, y'all. Without further ado, that's all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Jason is happily listening to Sting right now. He's not worried about you.
Was he listening to?
Sting. If I ever lose my faith in you.
Wow, that's a throwback.
That's like Jason throwbacks.